We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Yo guys! I'm Yuruzi. I'm back with the part 5 and this is what if Naruto was sent to the world of Inuyasha. Naruto has lost everything in the final battle. He is asked to aid a group in their journey. But will his own grief and pain get in the way? Or will this new group heal his broken soul? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 27, If Only for One Night. Blackness. That is all that he really knew, as his mind awoke again into consciousness. Such weariness he had not yet known capable of existing, clouded his mind and coated his muscles and bones. Slowly, he opened his eyes, glazed over blues stared dully at the starry sky. He sat at the base of a tree, his entire body felt like a block of lead, his head throbbed with pain. Everything just hurt, his heart, his body, even his very soul, tore away at him. Why did everything hurt so much? Why was it that the burdens were placed on his shoulders alone? First, it was that of the Kyuubi, then, in a way it was the Akatsuki's persecution of him, and finally it was to be the last living remnant of his world. A constant reminder in and of itself, that everyone he once loved was now dead. A small, sad smile graced his features as his eyes clouded over with tears. Tsunade, Jiraiya, Kakashi, Irika, Sakura. He missed them, more than any would ever know. Tsunade and her addictive gambling habits, Kakashi, his laid-back attitude, always showing up late reading that stupid book, Jiraiya, getting his ass grinded into powder by the females he peeked on whenever he got caught. Shizune, her soft demeanor and kind disposition whenever he got injured. Irika, ever the worried mother hen, constantly checking on him. Sakura, much like an older sister. Lee, the crazy cousin that everyone liked but no one wanted to be around for too long. Kiba, the annoying bastard that constantly competed with him. Shino, the quiet guy that observed everyone in the room, the one you knew that despite the fact you didn't talk much, that he would back you up should shit hit the fan and you'd do the same for him. 10-10, they had grown close a few months before the final battle. Mainly when her and Niji broke up, Lee had been out on a mission with Guy and she had no one to really turn to. He had walked into her weapons shop and found her sniffling. The rest, as they say, is history. Hinata, the girl that had loved him from the shadows. Ino, the girl that was almost as loud as him. Shikamaru, the lazy bastard that just pissed you off after spending too much time with him and hearing his constant mutters of troublesome. And Chuji, the chubby, big-boned guy that always seemed to be the jolliness of the party. Niji, the stoic kid that you had to beat some sense into every now and then. He wanted to blame someone. A part of him wanted to blame the Kyuubi, blame her entirely for all of his suffering. First because of the hate and prejudice he suffered at the hands of the villagers, and then, the attacks of the Akatsuki that destroyed his home and took the lives of those precious to him. But, perhaps because of his nature, his upbringing, or because she had once been a part of him, he could not bring himself to let the blame rest solely upon her. There was no doubt that she was partly to blame, but while Kyuubi may have attacked the village, she did not dictate the actions of the villagers. From ignorance, from fear, or just because of simple human nature, they chose to hate him. They could have seen things differently, they could have had faith in their former Hokage. But they chose the easier path. Then, the Akatsuki. Why was it that humans were so effective at killing each other? You know, when a spider eats its own offspring, humans feel appalled and some say, how could they? They're killing their own kind. Don't humans do the same? Akatsuki, in their greed, in their arrogance, or simply their lust for war and power, chose to try to raise themselves above the heavens. To do what no mortal was meant to do. To control immortals. Perhaps, even he himself was to blame. Perhaps he himself was selfish, in his desire to remain with his friends, he had placed them all in danger, never once thinking of the repercussions of his actions. He had simply smiled, with foolish, naive hope that everything would simply work out. It didn't. And as a result, he had lost everything. So the blame was everywhere, everyone was perhaps partially to blame. But still, why had he survived? Why did he have to continue on with the weight of lost souls holding him, gripping him for all they were worth? He took a shaky breath as tears, softly shining in the pale moonlight, trailed down his cheeks. He just wanted to rest, He was tired, so tired. As the darkness claimed him again, he could hear soft laughter. In his mind's eye, he could see all of his friends, laughing, smiling as they did before, when things were still so simple. It was a dream, he knew. But, perhaps, just for tonight, he could pretend again. Perhaps for one night, he could have peace again. If only for one night. Chapter 28, Hello Rin is Rin. Naruto's eyes slowly opened. The rays of the morning sun, just beginning to rise over the horizon, bathing the area in a soothing orange glow. He let out a small sigh and just sat there for a while, willing himself to gather the strength to at least get through the day. Soon, however, he felt two chakra signatures, at the edges of his somewhat dimmed senses. They were both small, one was distinctly demonic while the other was human. How odd. He stood slowly, his stiff muscles and sore bones protesting against his movement. He began walking towards the two chakra sources, eventually taking to the trees to keep his stealth. Soon, the sound of a child's voice reached his ears. It was distinctly familiar. Then he could hear the words. "An, do you know where Sesomaru-sama went? Rin is scared." The voice of a little girl. Then when the names registered in his mind, he immediately knew who they were. The young girl that traveled with Sesomaru and his two-headed dragon steed. He finally leapt to a branch where he could observe the dragon and young girl. The little girl was riding on the dragon's back, looking around with a somewhat scared gaze as the shadows of the forest seemed to encroach on them. For a moment he contemplated scaring the girl with a genjutsu, but eventually decided against it. He was about to leap away when he decided to check the surrounding area, spreading out his senses in all directions, and realized that Sesomaru was nowhere near the area. His eyes narrowed somewhat. Had Sesomaru decided to abandon the girl? His reasons for taking her in was a mystery in itself, so perhaps he had merely tired of her presence and the dragon had merely fallen behind. He sighed. Abandoned or not, he wasn't about to leave her abandoned in the middle of the woods without the demon lord around. He sighed again before silently leaping down. The lord of the western lands was not used to defeat. The feeling of being beaten by another had scarcely occurred in his life. Only against his father had he ever experienced true defeat, and to some small extent, when Inuyasha had cut off his arm, though he knew it was because of simple underestimation of your opponent that such a thing had occurred. Now, however, he was experiencing a feeling of complete defeat and mind-numbing pain to go with it. He did not know what had occurred. One second he had been sitting in the middle of his camp, the next, he and Jaken had been surrounded by a red light and they had reappeared somewhere in the east shores, as he recognized some of the plants in the area from an excursion he had during his childhood with his father when he moved to propose an alliance with the eastern wolf tribes. Flashback. As the red light that had surrounded him finally dissipated and he realized rather quickly where he was, he began looking around. He noticed that Jaken was laying in a heap nearby, still sleeping, the worthless toad. A graceful laughter reached his ears, melodic in its tone. He turned and saw a woman, with fiery red hair and a kitsune tail floating down to stand on the shifting sands of the beach. So I finally get to meet the son of the great dog general face to face. She seemed to look him up and down for a moment before she spoke, her small, confident smile never leaving her face. "I must say your father was certainly much more enticing specimen than you are." Sesomaru's eyes narrowed slightly at the disrespect few people dared to give. "Wench, I know not why you have brought me here, nor do I care. You will return me to my encampment or face the consequences of your foolish actions." She laughed again, mockingly. "Please, foolish pup, your father could barely hold a candle to me. You are no more than a chew toy to me," he snarled before rushing forward, unsheathing Tokujin and attacking. Swinging the blade in an arc that would have cut her stomach open, he was immensely surprised when she merely stopped the incoming attack with just 2 fingers, catching the blade between them. His eyes narrowed and he pushed a good portion of his yoki into the blade, delivering a full-powered dragon blast at point-blank range. He was confident she would be mere shreds when the dust cleared, which was why he could not stop his lips from parting in surprise as the dust settled and it revealed the woman without a single scratch on her, grinning a grin that was a mix between one of Naruto's old foxy grins and one of Orochimaru's old "I'm a walking therapeutic failure" grin. "How rude," she drawled before yanking the sword out of his hand and kicking him with enough force to break both his armor and his ribs in a single blow, not to mention knocking the wind right out of him. He hit the sand and rolled a few times before he came to a stop on his hands and knees, clutching his chest, coughing up blood, while simultaneously trying to get air back in his lungs. He looked up and glared at the woman who now casually held his blade, Tokujin, with one hand on the blade itself. She tossed it up in the air and caught it by the hilt, closed one eye and examined the blade, giving it a few test swings. Sheet at sked. My, how craftsmanship has been lost in the years I've been resting. She said in mock sadly before she did something that shocked him greatly. She tossed the blade in the air and with a snap of her fingers it shattered into millions of tiny pieces that looked more like dust than anything else. He stood glaring at the woman who merely smiled. She spoke again, this time igniting the full force of his fury. My, such a foolish dog, your father would have certainly been ashamed of how weak you turned out to be. His eyes bled into red and he transformed into his true form, snarling and growling at her, his acidic saliva hissing as it touched the ground. Kyubi's eyes seemed to gain a malicious gleam in them as she stared up at the pristine white fur that was Sesomaru's true form. She placed a hand over her mouth as she spoke her next words, with some amusement in them. Ichen, my so angry. Very well. Let's see how long you last. Sesomaru growled low and deep in his throat as chakra swirled about her form, growing in size and intensity of the heat until it was like standing in front of a furnace. Finally the chakra dissipated, revealing a two-tailed kitsune who stood on equal height with the great dog. The fox appeared to be grinning and Sesomaru soon heard a voice in his head. Well then, let us see what you can do, son of Inu no Taicho. The message was as clear as day. You can never measure up to your father. Flashback end. He didn't remember much after that, but the fact that he couldn't smell any blood other than his own nearby indicated that she had been the victor, and apparently, without receiving a single injury. It was quite humbling and alarming. He had not sensed any false strength, not even the Shirkan, meaning that all that strength was hers alone. How could someone so powerful have evaded everyone's knowledge for such a long time? It was mind-boggling. Even his father had never said anything of such a powerful being. He groaned in pain. Jaken was still unconscious, most likely placed under some kind of spell. He groaned in pain again and stood shakily. He could not stay here. He had to get to Rin. She wouldn't last more than 2 days even with On there to defend her. He struggled to lift himself, using his right arm to lean against the cave wall. He struggled to walk. Finally he reached the entrance of the cage where a red transparent barrier had been set up. He snarled. He would no doubt have to wait until his strength returned to him before he had enough strength to undo the barrier set up by the strange demoness. He then noticed a small scroll at the entrance of the cave. He knelt down and picked it up. He unrolled it and began to read. Well then, pup, since you're reading this, I assume you managed to drag your sorry carcass here. Know that there is only one attack that you can allow you to escape this prison, and it can only be achieved with that blade that you have on your side. Sesomaru looked down to the Tensasaiga. A blade he had long ago deemed unworthy of battle, and narrowed his eyes. What game was that demoness playing? If you can discover a way to use the Tensasaiga properly in 1 month and escape, I will give you back your left arm. If not, well then you won't get anything except your freedom, and if you cannot even gain that, well then, you will starve and die. Enjoy yourself, son of Inu no Taicho. Oh, and do not worry about the girl, she is safe and you may track her down should you escape. He growled low in his throat and burned the scroll with his acidic yoki. He sat down and closed his eyes. He would need to rest in order to gather his strength. Rin was jerked away from her, looking into the trees as On spun around, nearly knocking her clear off her seat. The dragon growled and she had to clear the cobwebs before she was able to look at a strange blonde man wearing a mask walking out of the shadows with what appeared to be a smile on his face. Rin stared at the strange man and blinked owlishly at him as he simply smiled back, his eyes as upside-down U's. He lazily held up a hand and waved, "Hiya." Rin still blinked at him with those wide brown eyes as if he was the most fascinating thing ever. While On continued to growl, Naruto refrained the urge to shift from foot to foot as she continued to stare at him. Finally, after a good 5 minutes, she patted On the head and the creature stopped growling, staring at Naruto with a cautious gaze. Naruto raised an eyebrow but did not comment on it. "Hello, man with funny hair. Rin is Rin and On is On." She introduced herself in her own way. Naruto smiled and stepped forward cautiously, stretching out a hand to one of On's heads. One head sniffed his palm slightly before nuzzling it slightly, indicating he was alright. Naruto smiled at the little girl and stretched out his hand. "Hello Rin, my name is Naruto." She beamed up at him and shook his hand exuberantly. "Hello Naruto-sama." He chuckled softly at her exuberant nature. It reminded him of Moegi. He shook his head slightly to push away the memories and smiled down at the young girl. "Well, Rin-chan, mind telling me what a cute little girl like you is doing out here?" he said, poking her stomach, earning a giggle from the girl. She then grew somber and began looking around. "I was looking for Sesomaru-sama." Her eyes began to tear up. He wasn't there when I woke up. Sesomaru-sama is always there when I wake up. He patted the girl on the head and kneeled down so as to be at eye level. Hey now, I'm sure Sesomaru-sama is just fine. Tell you what, how about you come with me for a while and you can go back with him when he comes back to get you? She sniffled and looked up. Really? She asked, her lower lip jutting out in a cute way that just made his heart warm up in a way that he hadn't felt since the destruction of his home. He smiled a warm welcoming smile at the girl and nodded. Of course, and hey, we may just find him on the way to where I'm going. She beamed up at him again. Yay! She somehow managed to clamp on his neck with a vice-like grip. He chuckled and pulled her back slightly, setting her on On's saddle. He grabbed the dragon's legs and handed them to her. Come on. We're going north. She smiled and nodded, patting On again. The dragon turned and walked side by side with the ninja. Naruto let his eyes travel to the beaming child and felt a small smile quirk on his lips. Who knows? Perhaps this trip won't be so boring after all. Chapter 29, Not So Old Anymore. And then Jaken-sama's eyes grew so big they looked like they would pop out of his head, was Rin's exuberant voice as she moved her arms around excitedly trying to further emphasize her point. Naruto chuckled as he had to steady the girl before she fell off of On in what would no doubt be a rather painful fall. He released her and he smiled at her beaming face. He put a single finger to his chin and assumed a thinking pose. Can you show me just how big his eyes were? I can't really picture it, he said, fooling with her. She nodded and cupped her eyes in her hands, forming her palms into O's while trying to widen her eyes as much as possible. They were this big, she said. Naruto couldn't help it. He burst out laughing and nearly cried tears of mirth as she blinked at him, her face the picture of confusion. He finally calmed down and smiled at her confused expression before ruffling her hair. You're a good girl, Rin, he said, ruffling her hair as she beamed up at him. He smiled, but then a low growl rumbled through the area. Rin looked down at her stomach and blushed cutely while Naruto raised an eyebrow with an amused smile on his face. Well, now I think someone's hungry, he said, chuckling. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, looking at her sheepish and slightly apologetic expression. Rin didn't want you to think Rin was a buber. She tried to form the words she had always heard Jaken say about her, but it wouldn't come. Burden? He finally prodded after he caught on to what she was trying to say. She smiled cheerfully, as if he had just made a brilliant discovery, and nodded exuberantly. Jaken-sama always says that since Rin is a weak Negan and that Rin is a bubu-. Burden, he said again. Yup, she said to Sesomaru-sama. Naruto made a mental note to dismember the stupid toad when he met him. And what does Sesomaru say? She thought for a moment. Sesomaru-sama doesn't say anything, but Jaken-sama always has something bad happen to him when he finishes saying that. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Well, there was this one time that a rock hit him in the head. He usually goes to sleep when that happens. Knocked out, she just doesn't know how to say it. Then another time a tree fell on his head. Sesomaru cut a branch above his head, but she doesn't know how to say it, and she didn't actually see him do it. Then another time On stepped on him, and one time. Okay, he said, waving his hands to stop her before she got carried away. He smiled and knelt down to be at eye level. Well, you don't have to worry about that. You're no burden. Just a cute little girl. She beamed at him, but her smile dropped as he seemed to eye her critically. She fidgeted nervously under his gaze but said nothing. Say, Rin. He spoke calmly. When was the last time you washed behind your ears? Ha! She blinked owlishly. I said, when was the last time you washed your ears? He spoke calmly. I've seen some dirty ears in my day, but this. He leaned in and seemed to grab something behind her ear. When the girl looked at his hand, she saw a bright yellow flower. Is really, really bad, he said, smiling at the girl's astonished face. She began to furiously scratch behind her ears, trying to see if there were more of the flowers back there. He smiled and laughed. That was probably the cheapest trick in the book back in Konoha, but here, just one flower and they'll go crazy. He leaned down and presented the yellow piece of foliage to her. Would you like to keep it? She stopped scratching behind her ears and looked at the flower. She beamed at him again. He just couldn't get enough of that smile of hers. He smiled back, but when she moved to grab the flower, he gently caught her wrist, stopping her. When she looked up at him with a questioning gaze, he merely smiled, released her wrist and placed the yellow flower, in her hair, right under the cloth that kept a clump of her hair in a form of side ponytail. There. She smiled and again latched onto his neck in a hug with a surprising amount of strength. He laughed lightheartedly. It felt so good to laugh like that again, after so long. His laughs were usually weighed down by veiled sadness and despair, but this laugh was free of such things. It was a simple carefree laugh at the happiness he could bring himself, by making a young girl happy, even with the simplest of things. He stood, but this time instead of setting her down on On's saddle he hefted her up so that she was sitting on his shoulders. She squealed in surprise and grabbed a clump of his blonde hair, holding herself in place. He laughed, ignoring the slight pain to his scalp. "Well now," he spoke. "How about we find ourselves a river where we can make camp? I'll get you some food then." He awkwardly looked up at her as she leaned forward, looking down at him. With that same childish smile of hers she nodded furiously, making him laugh again. "Good." He turned back to the two-headed dragon at his side. "Come on." The dragon nodded and watched as the small human girl he had become fond of laughed cheerfully as the strange blonde-haired human carried her. The Inutaichi sat in a small camp. Currently only Kagome, Miroku, Sengo Kirara and young Shippu sat in the group. Kagome was cooking some fish Miroku and Shippu had caught while Sengo rested her eyes as she leaned against a tree. Miroku continued to pore himself over some maps and scrolls he had brought with him in hopes of finding some clue as to where their companion might be. Suddenly Inuyasha dropped down to their right. Kagome looked at him with slightly tired eyes. "Found anything yet?" He shook his head. "Nothing, not even a whiff of his scent." Kagura suddenly dropped down from the skies. "I haven't found anything either. The winds are strangely silent, but some whisper some strange word, ancient or antique. I can't figure out what it means." Kagome sighed and buried her face in her hands. "This is hopeless. We're 7 people looking for one guy that could be anywhere in Japan. How the hell are we gonna find him and Nariku's heart before he recovers and can have the strength to hide it from us again?" The air grew somber and a heavy silence descended upon the group as none of them really knew how to respond. Shippu jumped on her lap. "Don't worry, Kagome. I'm sure we'll find him soon." She smiled, but a feminine voice from the trees made the entire group jump and raise their weapons. "You should listen to the young kiddling little girl. I thought a priestess would have more faith than that." The entire group turned as a woman with a red fox tail and bright red eyes floated down from the skies onto the forest floor. My, what an odd group," she said, chuckling to herself. "A Miko, a Hanyu, a monk and demon slayer, a demoness born from a parasite, a Nico and a little kitsune." The group tensed and Miroku spoke up, his brow was dabbed with beads of sweat. "Inuyasha, this woman has a similar demonic aura as the one that took Naruto." "Kh." He scoffed, unsheathing Tetsusaiga. "Well then bitch, you gonna tell us where he is or am I gonna have to beat it out of you?" She smirked. "Oh brash Hanyu, I have come here for neither option. I merely came to tell you to cease your search for him. He will return to the old Miko's village when he is ready." "Yeah right, like, I'll believe that," Inuyasha said before lunging at her. Iron Reaver Soul St. He was cut off as the woman vanished and he suddenly felt searing pain throughout his entire body. He barely had time to scream before he fell unconscious, and hit the dirt with a thud. "Inuyasha!" The others yelled, startled. He had slashes and tears all along his body. It looked as if he had just gone through a meat grinder. "He'll live, but perhaps that will keep you all occupied, at least for the time being." They turned again and saw the strange woman was already leaving. The fact that they believed her to be the one who had taken Naruto, someone who had become a precious friend to their group, and the fact that she had just injured Inuyasha spurred them on. "Hirekatsu, Fun no Mai." The large boomerang soared through the air heading for the demoness with razor-sharp blades of wind trailing behind it. Kyubi merely turned her head slightly, smirking at their foolishness. Before she rounded fully and batted the giant boomerang away with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She placed a hand in front of her and the wind blades formed a circle in her palm. With 2 small sounds, 2 balls of wind energy flew back to the wind demoness and demon slayer, hitting both of them in the stomach and sending them flying, crashing through trees and into the realm of blissful unconsciousness. Miroku stepped in next. He threw several sutras, a fusion of both holy power and ninjutsu seals. As the sutras approached her she merely touched each of the papers, turning them into a purple-blue color. They swirled together and rushed back to Miroku, hitting him with the force of a freight train. One sutra slapped itself over his mouth, the other over his eyes. He struggled to take them off but it proved fruitless. Kyubi was about to turn away again when a pearlescent glow caught her attention. She turned again and saw an arrow, practically pulsing with holy energy, was heading straight for her. It was impressive for one so small. She placed her hand in front of it expecting the arrow to dissipate as soon as it came into contact with her yoki, but was surprised as the arrow seemed to resist her power for several seconds until it finally withered and burnt to ash. She looked at her slightly smoking hand in surprised bewilderment before turning to the equally astonished, for more or less the same reasons, girl. She smirked, her white fangs glistening in the moonlight as she stepped closer to the Miko who was already notching another arrow into her bow. With a quick flick of her wrist the bow was cut in half, a yoki whip similar to Sessamaru's coiling back into her fingers. "That's enough of that," she said with her familiar smirk. "Stay away from Kagome," she heard before a blue flame hit her arm. It would have taken off another's arm, but to her it was a mere tingling sensation. She looked to a small orange blur that lunged at her. She leaned back, avoiding the tiny creature. Shippu landed and tried to lunge at her again, always aiming at one of three arteries, in either the hip, the left arm or the jugular in the neck. She was surprised by his tenacity, but when he landed again she had two claws almost touching his forehead. She smirked at his scared expression. She pushed her fingers a little closer but was surprised when a holy barrier impeded her path. She turned to the young priestess again, who had formed her most powerful barriers around both herself and the little kit. To any other demon it would have proven effective. But this was no ordinary demon, this was the Kyubi no Kitsune. The most powerful being to have walked in either earth or hell. None dared to challenge her power and live. She smirked and pushed her fingers through the barrier, which shattered like delicate china when it hits the floor and touched Shippu's forehead. The little Kitsune's green eyes flashed red for a moment before he fell back, his eyes rolling to the back of his head. "Shippu!" Kagome cried as she rushed at him. Undoing her barrier she placed herself between the red-headed demoness and the young fox kit. "What have you done to him?" she said, glaring at her while holding back tears. Kyubi merely smiled and began floating away as silently as she had come. "Remember little Miko, he will return when he is ready." She floated until she was 20 feet in the air before a bright red flash of light illuminated the night sky for a mere second and she was gone, leaving a decimated group to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, Naruto watched as Rin slept peacefully after having eaten her fill of the fish he had caught in the river. When she had seen him in the water physically catching the fish she said she had wanted to try. The results had been less than dry. He had laughed at her when she had sputtered out the water that had gone up her nose when she fell in the water. She had pouted cutely and after several more tries she had asked him how he did it. So he had shown her, telling her how to control her breathing and relax herself so as not to startle the fish. She was definitely less than perfect, but what she lacked in talent she made up with in determination. She was a lot like him in that respect. At least during his younger days. Younger days, that's what old people said. He chuckled bitterly. Perhaps he was old. They do say you're as young as you feel. If so, he felt like he was centuries old. He sighed and let his hand idly push back a small strand of hair from Rin's head. She giggled and snuggled closer to his hand for warmth. He smiled fondly. Suddenly, he felt like he was 70 again. Chapter 30, So Begins a Rebirth. Sessamaru growled low in his throat as the red barrier continued to mock him as it glowed happily at the entryway of the cave. He had tried everything, his whips, his demonic strength. He would have transformed into his true form, but something was repressing his ability to do so. Jaken had awoken a few hours earlier, but after about 3 minutes of his annoying blabbering the Teokai of the West had thrown a pebble, hitting him square between the eyes, knocking him right the fuck out. He contemplated for a moment breaking around the barrier but decided against it for 2 reasons. The first is that he doubted the female yokai, powerful as she was, would do something as stupid as leave such a glaring hole in her prison, and the second was because he was way too stubborn to admit that he couldn't break through a simple barrier. So his only choice was to follow the female yokai's words and discover the secret Tensiga possessed that could destroy this barrier. He unsheathed the blade and lightly tapped the reddish barrier with the life-bringing weapon, watching as the glow rippled slightly. He looked down at the blade. He felt it pulse slightly, but it wasn't anything strong. If he were any other, he would have sighed. Instead, he merely shifted himself into a more comfortable position and remained standing. The answers would come to him. They always did. Naruto-sama. Came his voice as he opened a single eye, awakening from his slumber as a little girl bounded up to him carrying 3 fishes beaming up at him. She was moving very fast, so fast in fact that before he could fully wake up she skidded to a stop right in front of him. Kicking you dust everywhere. She smiled at him and held up her 3 fishes, happily smiling. Look, Naruto-sama. Rin caught fish. He blinked for a moment before looking her up and down. She was absolutely soaked, no doubt she had gone back to the river and caught the fishes on her own. He looked at the fishes in her hand and was surprised that she didn't seem squeamish like many young girls would be of the slimy scales grasped in her fingers. He grasped the fishes and spoke, somewhat lazily. Rin, did you go by yourself? She nodded, still smiling. He nodded and spoke up again. Don't ever go to the river by yourself again, without either me or An. Her smile was replaced by a confused frown. Why? Naruto-sama. He stood and took out a cloth, placing 2 fish on it to keep them from the dirt. He began skinning one. Because, without me or An there you could get hurt. A yokai could attack you, or you could trip and hurt yourself in the river. Or worse, he added silently. Rin nodded. Okay, Naruto-sama. He smiled at her. Good, now go and wake An, we'll be leaving as soon as we have breakfast. He said. The child nodded happily and ran off to the 2-headed dragon a few yards away. Naruto smiled as she heard her whisper softly in the dragon's ear, making the beast stir. One head woke and looked around dazedly before its eyes settled on Rin. It seemed to smile before it licked her cheek, making her giggle, while also coating her with saliva. Naruto gave a slightly amused, kinda grossed out grin at that. But she merely giggled and hugged the dragon head. He shook his head and flipped the fish over to take the scales off the other side. Finally, he looked to the logs that had been burning all night. There was still enough tinder among the ash to keep a good fire going, so making a few simple hand seals he blew out a small stream of flames, lighting it in seconds. He heard a gasp to his side and saw Rin staring at him as if his head had just blown up. He then remembered that it was An who had lit the fire last night, not him. He smiled at her completely astonished expression and spoke. Surprised? He asked with a raised eyebrow. She nodded dumbly. He chuckled at her expression. It was priceless. His eyes, filled with mirth, smiled at her. But then his eyes seemed to cloud over and he stared at her as if she was someone else. Without even thinking, he spoke. Would you like to learn? He asked slowly. Rin's eyes widened almost comically and she suddenly let out this ear-piercing squeal, making him resist, covering his ears and doubling over in pain before she managed to tackle him. Somehow she had gotten the speed of a jounin in 0.00000000001/2 seconds and had gained the strength of a pissed-off Akimichi in the process. Naruto-sama will teach Rin magic. She squealed again, her arms around his neck in a powerful vice. He managed to laugh despite his current lack of oxygen. He patted her head affectionately. He didn't know why he had offered. It had just come out. He didn't regret it though, he just wished he knew why he acted so rashly. Roughly 3 hours later. 1 hour to pry Rin off, the second to cook and eat breakfast, and the last to get her to calm down enough to sit still. Naruto smiled as he finished. There. He said, smiling slightly. Rin blinked as she tried to stare at the strange symbol on her forehead. She obviously failed miserably, but Naruto found no ends of amusement watching her face scrunch up with effort and her tongue stick out from her mouth. She had 8 symbols on her. The kanji for the numbers 1 through 8 were brushed onto her skin, beginning just above the left temple and ending at her heart. Naruto had done the process quickly so as not to embarrass the girl. The numbers were painted over the exact 8 spots where the celestial gates were in the body. He grasped her shoulders and made her look him in the eyes. Rin, it's very important that you listen to me. This procedure might hurt, or it can be painless. It depends from person to person. Also, there is a chance that it won't work at all. So I don't want you to get your hopes up, okay? She smiled happily and leaned up to give him a pat on the head. Naruto blinked owlishly at her as she merely smiled up at him in her delightful way. Naruto-sama can do it. She chirped. He stared at her slightly dumbfounded before he broke out into a warm smile. He placed one hand over her heart, where the last symbol was, and another over her head, his thumb resting on the first. Ready? He asked gently. She nodded with a smile on her face. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes with a small smile hidden beneath his mask. His chakra swirled about him. It entered her coil system, through the first and last of the 8 chakra gates. This procedure was used by civilians that found themselves drafted into the shinobi business at times of a village's great need. This had only been used a few times, mainly during Konoha's founding. Since civilians did not use their chakra coils for anything other than its natural use, which helped maintain the inner organs, the coils later on could not be used for more than that without extensive training and conditioning, and even then they would be mediocre at best. This method was a quick, if perhaps a bit painful in some cases, to widen chakra pathways into a more manageable way. Children's chakra pathways were easier to handle than adults, hence why they started so young. The only reason he was really doing this was because after nearly half a millennia without the use of chakra, the human species may no longer have the manageability of it as they had back in his time. She gasped at the sensation as his chakra moved through her pathways. Power long forgotten tingled beneath her skin, and she could feel small pin pricks of electricity coursing through her. Naruto controlled his vast reserves as best he could, moving it through her. The chakra coils were just large enough to move the minimum amount throughout her body. Slowly, as gently as possible, he began to expand them. He heard her gasp again, but she seemed in no real pain, and so he continued. He expected her pathways to stop expanding at what would have been a civilian's level back in Konoha, but was surprised as they continued expanding, continued spreading out. In the end, he was forced to stifle a small gasp. The end result was that her pathways were almost the size of an average genin. It was amazing considering both the fact that she had not inherited this and that she was considerably younger than most genin were back in his village. He opened his eyes again and saw Rin staring at her hands in utter astonishment as her chakra swirled around her. He smiled gently. "How do you feel?" "Rin feels," she began, but stopped as the chakra died down and she fell forward, asleep. Naruto caught her and smiled. He lifted her up with both arms. The child snuggled against him, sighing happily. He chuckled at that. "Did you faint on purpose, Rin?" he asked her unconscious form. He chuckled again as she snuggled closer into him. He walked back towards his campsite where Aan was waiting with a few dead rabbits the dragon had hunted while he was out. The dragon raised both heads and walked over at a brisk pace, nuzzling Rin in concern as he had never seen the child in that state without it being night time. Naruto smiled and patted Aan on the head. "Don't worry, Aan. She's fine, just a little tired. She'll be fine by tomorrow," he said, setting her down on the bundle of cloths he had used to make her a bed. My, working on rebuilding the village already, I see," came a very familiar voice. Aan growled and stood, shielding both Naruto and Rin from the newcomer as she walked out of the shadows of the forest. The red-headed woman raised a hand and waved it in front of the beasts' faces. "Sleep." And just like that, the dragon yokai fell in a dull heap. Naruto covered the young girl in her blankets before he stood to face the kitsune. They stared at each other a few moments before Naruto turned to the right and began walking back to the river. Kyubi watched him as he reached the edge of the camp and turned back to look at her over his shoulder. "Not coming?" he asked her before continuing down to the river. She raised a perfect eyebrow before following silently. Moments later they found themselves at the edge of the riverbank. Naruto washed his hands free of the excess ink and stood. He turned and faced the woman at his side, eyeing her with a cold, flat look. She looked back at him, her red eye dancing with mischievous amusement. He looked away, toward the blue sky above. "Mind explaining what you want now?" he said. His voice was clipped and tense. "Ah, what's the matter, Naruto-chan?" she asked with that deceptively innocent voice as she walked around him, her hand trailing from his right shoulder to his left and letting a clawed fingertip brush across his jawline. The fabric of his face mask was heard as her razor-sharp claw gently traced it, ending at his chin. She made him look at her. She smirked at his blank yet razor-sharp eyes. "I just came to deliver a warning to you, little Naruto-chan." She leaned in, and Naruto could feel the caress of her warm breath against his ear. He remained tense and stiff. "You had better prepare yourself, little Naruto-chan. Next time you meet Naruto, you'll need a lot more strength than what you currently have." She laughed and licked his earlobe and let her fang trace over it playfully as her claw drew circles along his chest armor, with just enough force so the screeches could be heard faintly by human ears. Naruto's eyes shifted to look at her profile next to him. "Am I to assume that this is your doing, Kyubi?" The ancient kitsune merely smiled and pulled back. She let her eyes travel down to the lone kunai he held against her chest, right above her heart. "I wonder if even you would survive a knife through the heart," he said quietly, to himself mostly. She grinned and moved forward, pressing her body to his. She didn't even feel the prick of the skin as the kunai cut her lightly. She leaned into his face, placing them mere centimeters apart. "Would you like to find out?" She purred, her fiery red eyes dancing with embers. "Do you want to pierce my heart, Naruto-chan?" She pressed herself closer to him. He could feel her chest against his and her well-toned legs brushing against him, as well as her taut stomach. Despite the fact that he constantly reminded himself that this was the Kyubi no Kitsune, he could still feel his body responding to this. He was, after all, a male. Naruto met her gaze with his own, not speaking a word, merely staring at her silently. She chuckled and traced a finger along his jaw again. Until next time then. She stepped back, over the water and to the other side of the river before dissolving into a thin red mist. It swirled about him once before dispersing. He stared at the gently flowing waters for a while before he silently placed the kunai back in his pouch and walked off with a quiet sigh. Chapter 31, A Child's Innocence. Naruto was once again skinning one of the animals he had hunted. Just about a day or two more before he reached Totusai and have his blade made, Rin, who was currently sitting a few yards away practicing the hand seals from some detailed drawings he had made for her, or was, Naruto, soon felt a weight jump onto his back latching onto his neck. Naruto-sensei, Rin learned the hand thingy, she said, beaming at him. Naruto chuckled and lifted her over his head and set her down in front of him. Oh really? Well then, show me the Inu, and they're called hand seals. Her face scrunched up in concentration as she twisted her fingers around in the correct way. This one, she chirped, bouncing on the balls of her feet. Naruto nodded. Good, now Ryu. Her tongue peeked itself out between her lips as she formed a slightly more complicated hand seal. He continued this process for several seconds, merely correcting the Tori seal and the Osubuta, which were one of the more complicated seals. He nodded, smiling as he ruffled her hair. You did well, Rin. Now then, let me teach you how to use those seals to bring out the power which is known to my people as chakra. She listened with bated breath, wide honey-brown eyes staring at his. It was almost disturbing, but, in a weird way, cute. He cleared his throat. Now then, if I was my old sensei Irika, I would explain every technicality and little detail that you will no doubt need to hear 6 or 7 times before you understand, but I prefer a practical approach. He extended his hands. Give me your hands, Rin. Obediently she did so. He placed his hands over hers and gently extended his chakra into her tenketsu system. Rin gasped again at the unfamiliar sensation. Naruto looked into her confused, slightly fearful brown ones. What you feel is my chakra flowing through your tenketsu. The tenketsu is what allows your chakra to flow through your body. You can feel your own as it forms around mine, right? At her nod he continued. Good. Now, what I want you to try to do is push my chakra out of your system, back into mine, and then try to extend your chakra into my own tenketsu. Focus on the parts that you know for certain are yours and not mine, okay? Are you ready? She nodded again. Naruto smiled reassuringly. Her face scrunched up in concentration, and after several minutes he could feel his chakra receive a slight nudge. Good. He thought. Her forehead had small beads of sweat forming on it, and after a few more minutes he felt a stronger nudge this time, then a weak, yet continuous push on the chakra he placed in her system. He smiled as his chakra was pushed from its original position along her wrists into the palm of her hands. Just one more push. Finally, she was able to push his chakra out of her system. He pulled his hands away. She looked up at the lack of contact, confused, breathing a little heavier than before. He smiled. You did well, Rin, but I think you should rest for now, okay? We'll keep going tomorrow morning. But Rin didn't finish it. She whined with a small pout. Naruto smiled. That's okay, you did really well for your first time. He picked her up, settling her on his shoulder, and smiled at her as she let out a delighted squeal. Now then. He kneeled down and picked up the pieces of the cut-up carcass from ropes he had tied around it. How about we keep going a little longer before we set these to cook, eh? She smiled and vigorously began to nod. Okay, Naruto-sensei. She beamed and looked to the side. Hun. She yelled, making the dragon rouse from its sleep. Not needing to be told more than once, the beast rose and trotted over to them. Naruto patted both heads and let one lick his palm before he continued on his way north, with Rin giggling on his shoulder and the dragon steed walking behind him. Nariku stilled from his place on his futon. His body was slowly regenerating, but he was nowhere near a level where he could even face the monk and slayer safely. Indeed, escaping the last confrontation had taken almost all of his strength. But, from the reports his insects had given him, the foolish blonde-haired ninja had died shortly afterwards by Inuyasha's hand, no less. He had to let a smirk cross his lips at that. The blonde had been a thorn in his plans from the moment he had arrived. So now he had ample time to gather his strength to face the Inu group. Only with Sesomaru did they have a chance of defeating him, and it was highly unlikely the Teokai would even consider joining his hated half-brother and his Negan allies. His musings were cut short as an amused voice reached him. "My, Naruchan certainly did quite a number on you, parasite." The voice spat out the last word with veiled contempt. Naraku tensed and formed his barrier around him, at least the strongest one he could muster in this state. "Who are you?" He kept his facade calm, but on the inside he was panicking. How the hell had anyone managed to keep themselves undetected for even a moment in his castle, as well as get this close to him? Was virtually impossible. His eyes grew wide with surprise and fear as his barrier shattered into a million pieces as a woman morphed in from the shadows. Now fool, I did not come here to kill you, I merely came here to give you this." She threw a large object at his feet, which clattered noisily against the hardwood floor. As Naraku picked it up with his only remaining arm, he gasped in surprise and dropped the item with another noisy clatter. That is. Indeed. Now then, I have done what I came here to do, and so I will take my leave. The sooner I am free of your presence the better. That said, she began to vanish but was stopped by the Hanyo's voice. "Wait!" Naraku called. "Why are you helping me?" She laughed coldly and turned her eyes, which danced with a hidden, detached amusement. "Make no mistake, insect, I am not helping you, you are merely a pawn that I will use to save the king in this particular game of shugi. He is, after all, the most important piece." She chuckled. "And pawns are always expendable." She vanished back into the shadows. Naraku's lips curled back in a snarl. "A pawn? Him? Ha! Foolish wench." As soon as he regained his strength and took the last of the shards from the Miko's cold dead fingers, he would hunt her down and kill her for her insolence. Naraku turned his attention away from the strange yokai and stared at the item at the foot of his futon in shock for a moment before a sick, twisted smile formed at his lips and he began to laugh hysterically. "With this gift and then the full power of the Shirkan jewel, I will become a living god." Naruto watched as Rin chewed happily on some spiced-up pieces of deer meat. He had already had what he needed. He wasn't full by any means, but she needed it more than him. He was currently leaning against a tree, watching as she had a one-sided conversation with An, who was currently eating his own meal. He smiled as she laughed. He found himself doing that often recently. She finished the meat and gave An the bone, giving both dragon heads an affectionate hug and pats on their heads before trotting up to Naruto. She plopped herself down, Indian style, holding her feet together with her hands. "What will we do tomorrow, Naruto-sensei?" she chirped. Naruto smiled, relaxing slightly. "You still need to learn the basics of molding chakra. At the rate you're going, I would guess about 2 to 5 days should be enough. After that I'll teach you the easiest jutsu." "Jutsu? Technique, it's my village's word for magic," he explained. Rin's mouth opened in an "oh," "it's called the Bunshin no Jutsu." She nodded and smiled happily. He ruffled her hair and leaned back against the tree, watching the starry sky. "Naruto-sensei, can Rin ask you a question?" He looked down, slight surprise and puzzlement were visible along his face. "Sure, Rin," he said after a brief moment. She seemed to shift nervously for a moment before she looked up at him with eyes that held sadness. "Naruto-sensei, Rin wants to know why Naruto-sensei's eyes are always sad." His eyes widened minutely and he struggled not to gasp. After a moment he regained his composure. "What?" This time she was shifting nervously, looking at her feet. "Well, Rin wants to know why Naruto-sama is sad." He composed himself and smiled at her. "I'm not sad, Rin." She shook her head and walked up to him, cupped his face with her small hands and made him look at her. "Naruto-sama's eyes are sad. Rin can see that when Naruto-sama smiles." Naruto took a deep breath, and this time he allowed some sadness to seep into his expression. He took her small hands in one larger one and looked into her eyes for a good long while before he smiled sadly. "When you lose someone important to you, Rin, it hurts, and sometimes, it takes a lot longer for the pain to go away." He explained gently. "Maybe we can find them again," she said innocently. He laughed lightheartedly. The sound was sad yet amused. He shook his head, gently ruffling her hair. "No, Rin, I don't think we can." She moved forward and hugged him then, her little arms wrapping around his neck. "Then Rin will stay with Naruto-sama until he does find the person he lost again." Naruto swallowed the lump in his throat and laughed at her innocence. He wrapped an arm around her and hugged her. "Thank you, Rin," he whispered as he let a lone tear fall from his eye. Chapter 32, Totosai. Naruto, Rin and An looked down from the lip of the massive volcano. Small pools of lava dotted the ground before them, and in the center of this fiery lair was what appeared to be bones of some fish demon shaped into a hut. Naruto felt a tug at his pant leg and looked down to see Rin looking at him a little scared of the fiery landscape. Naruto-sama. Why are we here? Naruto smiled. It's okay, Rin, I just came to find an old man that makes the best swords in the world. Her eyes seemed to brighten considerably and she beamed up at him. Naruto-sama's going to get a sword? She screamed enthusiastically, bouncing on the balls of her feet. Naruto smiled and nodded, kneeling down to pick her up and place her on An's saddle. Come on you two, let's see what this old man can do. Rin nodded happily as An seemed to grunt in agreement. Naruto placed his hands in his pockets and walked down the slope towards the old swordsmith's home. Inuyasha groaned, clutching his head as he blearily opened his amber-colored eyes to sit up and look around the room. Oh my head, what hit me? He looked around as his eyes adjusted to the light he took in the appearance of his comrades. You guys look like shit, everyone glared, for indeed they did look like shit. Miroku's arm was wrapped in a sling, his left knee was in a form of feudal-era cast and a bandage was wrapped around his head. Sango's armor was cracked and broken in several places. Around her waist were several bandages wrapped tightly so that her bruised ribs didn't shift too much. Kagura was the only one who was normal, though even she winced with a few movements. Inuyasha tried to place his hand on the ground to pick himself up sharp. Piercing pain tore up his arm, pulling a shocked scream of pain from him as he collapsed on his back, spreading more pain through his back. This time however he was able to bite back his scream. His heavy breathing was loud in his ears and he faintly heard Kagura snort, "Now who looks like shit?" He glared at the raven-haired demoness, "Bitch." He snarled, sitting up again, this time taking care with the injuries he currently sported. He looked around, then his ears perked up and a sliver of worry could be seen in his slitted gaze. Where's Kagome and Shippo? Miroku shifted slightly. Kagome is fine, she's down by the river gathering some more herbs and such. Shippo however. He trailed off towards the end. Inuyasha tensed. What? Miroku, what happened to Shippo? Inuyasha, came a surprised voice from the entryway. Inuyasha looked to the door and saw Kagome looking at him with a relieved smile on her face. But Inuyasha found something odd about this picture. Ah, that was it, there was a fox on her shoulder. Wait, why did the fox have green eyes? Inuyasha, are you feeling all right? Kagome asked, stepping forward and kneeling next to him, pulling him out of his stupor. Also interrupting him from making the obvious connections he was mere seconds away from making. Gasp! He does have a brain beneath that hair. Kagome, what happened to Shippo? The fox began yipping and running around. Kagome said nothing as she turned her eyes to the little fox that was currently jumping from foot to foot while waving two sticks in the air, thinking Inuyasha would make the connection on his own. After a few seconds the fox grew annoyed and bit his hand. Inuyasha batted him away. Not now, furball. Kagome, tell me what happened to Shippo. He said, beginning to grow agitated. The fox kit growled and lunged, this time biting on one of his sensitive ears. Inuyasha screeched in pain and latched onto the fox's tail, pulling him in front of his face, and reared back ready to throw the kid out the window. Kagome, horrified and not knowing what else to do, did the first thing that came to mind. Sit! No one can really describe the sound that came after. It was a mixture of cracking wood, spinal crunchings, a scream of surprise, pain, anger, pain which somehow managed to mix in an "oh shit" along with pain and, did I mention pain? Oh yes, and a slow groan of agony. Kinda like how when a woman kicks you in the nuts with the very tip of a steel-toed boot full force without any form of warning. Yeah, that groan. All of this was muffled even more as the furry little fox landed on Inuyasha's silver head, gently prodding the twitching ears as it seemed to whine something that sounded like, "Inuyasha? Are you dead?" Kagura snickered while Sango shook her head. Miroku spoke up. Well, if he wasn't dead before, he's certainly dead now. Kagome looked down to his form. Sorry, Inuyasha. She said, truly apologetic for once. But you were about to hurt Shippo. WF dit bej ut fel mph? Was his muffled reply, which translated into a painful, "Why didn't you tell me?" I have no idea what you said, but don't worry, as soon as I'm done patching everyone else up I'll start with you since it'll take me a while to redress all your wounds, so just sit tight. She said, petting one of his ears before turning to Sango, ignoring another of his painful groans. From her place in the corner of the room Kirara mewed lazily. Humans are such strange creatures. Naruto looked down at the old swordsmith as he lay sleeping at his feet. A snot bubble expanded and deflated with the old demon's breathing. "Hey old man," he called. At the lack of a response he tried again. "Toto-sai." "Nope," he continued to snore. His eyebrow twitched in annoyance and he roughly kicked the old man's side. "Wake up old man," he said again. Still snoring. Now Naruto was getting annoyed. Kneeling down he cupped his hands in front of his face, took a deep breath, focused chakra in his vocal cords, throat and mouth. He yelled in the old man's ear as loud as he could. "Wea-ak ki yo up." "Nope. Nothing." The blonde twitched and began making hand seals. Rin and An sat outside watching in silent fascination as bright flashes of light, small explosion sounds and strangely the sound of a cat hitting a trash can reached their ears. Naruto walked out looking annoyed and angry to the world. Rin was about to speak when some ash entered her nose, making her sneeze softly. "You know, one of those squeaky achoo's." "Who's making all that racket?" came an old withered voice from inside the hut. Naruto stopped, his eyebrow twitching rapidly as he slowly turned and saw an old demon walk out of the hut. He had big round eyes, horizontally stripped green clothing which may have at one point been a hakama and haori but now resembled a modified sack, and a large iron mallet over his shoulder. The old demon stopped and stared at Rin, then to An and then back to Rin. Suddenly he pointed and yelled, his mouth and eyes widening to ridiculous proportions. "Ah, you're the little girl that ravels with Sesomaru." He began looking around. "Oh no, he yelled as he ran around. Suddenly he had managed to get 700 pounds of wood and had nailed them to the entrance to his house, barricading it. He placed a sign in front that said, "Gone on vacation." "There!" he exclaimed enthusiastically until he realized something. I locked myself out." And so he tore down the wood, stepped into his hut and began placing the barricade up again. He was about to hammer another nail when a gloved hand wrapped around his wrist. Toto-sai slowly looked over to a blonde human who was staring at him in an irritated and slightly bored expression. "Sesomaru isn't here, Rin is traveling with me for now and I came to request you make me a sword." Toto-sai looked him over. "You are human. No human can handle the immense power one of my blades would wield, and besides you must bring a piece of a demon, such as a horn, bone or fang, in order to order a blade from me. So please leave and let me get back to my nap." Naruto sighed and removed the small fang from his pocket, holding it out for the old swordsmith. "Here's your fang. Now make me the damn blade." Toto-sai was about to say no, thinking the fang was nothing more than a weak demon's fang, but paused as he saw a small pulse of red chakra come from the fang. It couldn't be. He grabbed the fang and gasped, stepping back as if he'd just been slapped. The power, he had only sensed it once before. It was when Inano Taicho had brought him the blade of Sunya to be inspected. The sword from hell it was called, but even the power he had sensed from that paled in comparison to what he felt here. When he had asked the great dog general where he had gotten such a blade, he had said that it was a gift from a demoness of immense power. "Where did you get this?" Toto-sai asked, his goofy demeanor gone, replaced by absolute seriousness. "A woman gave it to me," he answered truthfully. Toto-sai nodded. "Very well, I will forge you the sword, but if I find that in the end you are unworthy I will have it destroyed." Naruto paused for a moment before nodding. Toto-sai was about to speak again, but small hands gently tugged his pant leg. He looked down and saw Rin beaming up at him. "Hello." "Rin is Rin." Toto-sai smiled and looked her over. "Well, now aren't you a sweet little girl? I would think that traveling with that whelp Sesomaru would make you as cold as he is." She leaned forward and grabbed his, running her hands around his face and head. "Why are you so wrinkly?" She rubbed the top of his bald head. "And what happened to all you hair, mister?" Naruto chuckled and gently pried her hands away. "Come on Rin, let me teach you the Bunshin no Jutsu." "Okay," she chirped, grabbing his hand as he led her out. Toto-sai watched them leave and looked down to the fang in his hand. Could it be, Kyubi? Chapter 33, Trust. Naruto smiled down at the little girl as a bright smile threatened to split her face in two as two perfect clones flanked her. "Rin did it, Naruto-sama." She laughed delightedly as she jumped up and down. "Rin did it, Rin did it, Rin did it," she chanted, skipping circles around him. Naruto was about to praise her newfound success when a familiar voice spoke up from behind him. "That you did, little girl." He tensed, his eyes going from warm and inviting to guarded and cold in seconds as he looked over his shoulder to the familiar vixen that had been making many appearances of late. Rin shyly poked her head out from behind his legs. Catching sight of the red-haired woman, she smiled and waved at her. "Hello, pretty lady." Kyubi raised an eyebrow but laughed lightly to herself as she walked over to them. She walked around Naruto, sensing his unease as his eyes remained trained on her, watching her every movement. She smiled as she knelt down to be at eye level with the little girl, moving her right claw with tantalizingly slow movements, making sure that Naruto knew what she could do in an instant if she so desired. She was rewarded as she felt him tense and his killer intent rise, so it only affected her. She ruffled the oblivious girl's hair affectionately. "Well, now aren't you a cute one? What's your name, little girl?" she asked kindly, completely ignoring Naruto. Rin smiled completely and gratefully innocent to the interaction between them. "Rin is Rin, pretty lady." Kyubi smiled, her enlarged fangs catching the little girl's attention. "That's a pretty name, Rin. If you want you can call me Q. I like pretty lady, but it's a little too long for me." Rin nodded and was about to speak again when Naruto cleared his throat, catching her attention. "Rin, I need to talk alone with Q here. Why don't you go and see what Todesai's doing?" She looked between them for a moment before she nodded with a happy smile on her face and ran to Todesai's hut, where the old man was hopefully working on his sword. As soon as the little girl was out of earshot, Naruto and Kyubi's gazes slowly turned to each other, her features twisting from a small smile into a wicked grin as his gaze faded from a reassuring smile to a calculative and cold gaze. My Naru-chan, that's very rude, thinking you need to protect little Rin-chan from me?" Her fangs lengthened somewhat. Naruto's cold pools of ice glared back coldly at her. "What are you up to, Fox?" She placed a look of mock hurt on her face. "Why, Naru-chan, I'm hurt. You'd actually think I was planning something." She let a fanged smirk cross her features again. "What could have ever given you that idea?" His eyes narrowed. "Stop playing your tricks, Fox. You show up, suddenly Sesomaru's missing, Rin is right in my path, and Naraku has somehow become stronger. All this, when you make your reappearance into this world. Some people would call it coincidence, others fate. But I've never believed in either." Her smirk widened. My, it was always so much easier to fool you when you were just that cute little boy that yelled to the world you were going to become Hokage. My, how foolish you were." Fiery red clashed with cold blue. His eyes, so fierce, so powerful in their stubborn bravery, and yet, still missing something. She looked to Todesai's hut, smirking in her wolfish way. "I remember that I also told you to get stronger." She paused as she turned to face him again. "So why haven't you?" He merely stared back impassively. Her smile widened at his lack of a response as she turned back to the hut. "I see." She paused as she calmly, almost tauntingly raised her right claw to eye level as red chakra slowly formed around her hand. "Well then, if you won't get stronger for yourself, then perhaps you'll become stronger for another." She felt him tense, his chakra spiking in a second as the words rolled off her tongue. Her smile turned evil as she rounded back on him. "Ah, yes, that always was where you found your strengths, didn't you? Always fighting for others rather than yourself. You always were a peculiar with that, weren't you? Let's see if that old fire is still there." She rushed forward, the red chakra gathered in her hand flaring to life. Naruto's eyes flashed as he moved with speed previously unimagined, appearing in her path, the Rasengan swirling in his hand ready to take its next victim. He halted her advance, grabbing her roughly by the throat and pushing her down to the ground, his left hand around her neck, his left foot holding down her right and her left hand holding the wrist which held the Rasengan back from slamming into her gut. She pressed her legs to his chest and pushed, kicking him off with enough force to send him sprawling onto his back. She leapt up, landing on top of him with her right leg over his chest, her left leg pinning down his right arm, her right hand holding down his left, and her remaining claw gripping his throat tightly as her claws slightly pierced the thin layers of the skin on his neck. He grunted as she roughly jerked his head to face her, holding his neck with careful precision as her razor-sharp claws drew even more blood, yet he didn't flinch. He showed absolutely no fear. She stared into his eyes, his calm deep-sea blue eyes which held more in them than any other she had seen in her vast lifetime. But there was something there. Something that wasn't there before. It took her a moment to find it and then another moment to recognize it. Determination. That simple determination that could spit death in the face and stare fearlessly into the blackest abyss that could only belong to him was burning once again, smoldering within those cold blue eyes again. She leaned down, nuzzling his cheek with her own. She whispered in his ear, the words rolling seductively off her tongue. "Now, why would you go and do something as stupid as that?" she asked as she pulled away, letting her crimson orbs meet his sea blue ones. He didn't deign her question with an answer. Instead, he chose to ask one of his own. What are you planning? She grinned, her enlarged canines showing themselves from between her lips. That would be telling now, wouldn't it? I suppose you'll just have to trust me. Trust you? He asked incredulously. I've lost many things in my lifetime, but my sanity has remained mostly intact. She smiled a full-blown smile. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but if there's one thing you've learned from me, my little Naru-chan, is that I've never really lied to you, and two, I wouldn't need all this planning to kill you, after all. She tightened her claws around his neck, letting the razor edges draw out more blood from the small nicks. I could do that right now with very little trouble to speak of. His eyes narrowed in irritation. But you won't, you'd rather use me for entertainment. Her eyes danced with veiled amusement as she slowly released his neck and stepped back, allowing him to stand. Red wisps of energy swirled around her, lifting her up to the sky, her smile still firmly plastered on her face. Indeed I would, and also, that cute little Rin girl would be so sad if you died. There was a bright flash which forced the blonde ninja to shield his eyes when he opened them again. The fox demoness was nowhere to be seen, the echoes of her sultry laughter the only evidence she had been there at all. Naruto narrowed his eyes at the sight, the small cuts along his neck already healing as he wiped away the blood. He turned back to Todosai's hut, calming himself as he drew closer to it. As he approached, the kitsune's words bounced around within the walls of his skull. He wished he knew what the damn fox was planning. He needed to know in order to protect. He paused. To protect. It was not a thought that had occurred to him since he had arrived at this place. Within Inuyasha's group he felt the need to help them, but never to actually protect them, not in the way he had thought of it just now at least. But, to protect, what did he have to protect now? A light giggle escaped the walls of the hut and floated into his ears. He recognized it immediately and it brought a smile to his face. Rin. He looked up to the sky, his smile growing content, truly content for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. If not for anything or anyone else, he would grow stronger for her, to protect her, and perhaps more would join that list in time. He parted the cloths that covered the entrance of the hut and immediately sweat dropped. No wonder they never heard the commotion outside. Todosai lay sprawled on his back, sleeping, a massive snot bubble which Rin continued to poke with a random stick, amazed that it didn't pop, was hanging from his left nostril as he snored, quite loudly too. Rin, noticing Naruto's presence, smiled as she let go of the stick and ran to him. Naruto-sama, where is the pretty lady? Naruto smiled somewhat uneasily at the thought of Rin forming an attachment to the most powerful demon in existence. But she had already formed with the most frosty demon in existence, so this wasn't much of a stretch. She had to leave Rin. He explained. Now, I'm going to go train. Why don't you try to wake up Todosai here? Okay, Naruto-sama. She giggled as she ran back to Todosai, jumping over Ann's heads as she did so. She crouched down next to him and began gently whispering in his ear. Ji-chan. Time to get up. Naruto smiled at the scene before walking out. So you managed to find out, did you? Sesomaru turned his head to the direction of the voice, finding the red-maned kitsune who had imprisoned him in the first place, Tetsusaiga, pulsing at his side, a silver glow coming from it as he stood outside the cave. And with 2 days to spare too. She spoke up mostly to herself as she crossed her arms and smirked. Very well then, Inu Taicho. She laughed at his narrowed eyes. Enjoy your reward. She flicked her wrist, a small ball of red chakra forming and propelling itself towards Sesomaru, striking him in what remained of his left arm. Burning pain tore through the appendage as bone, muscle, tissue, skin and nerve reformed before his very eyes. The process was over in a few seconds, when Sesomaru looked again, his left claw, as impeccable as he remembered it, was now again at his side. The dog demon looked to the kitsune. You said Rin was safe, where is she? She looked back over her shoulder at him. Oh, she's around, perhaps you should go look for her. She laughed once again, vanishing into the dense shadows of the forests as silently as she had come. The Teiokai watched her leave before he raised his nose in the air and took a deep breath, inhaling the surrounding scents. Finding a suitable direction, he turned and began making his way. Wait for me, my lord, was the terrible screech that reached his ears from, once again, conscious Jaken. Sesomaru refrained the urge to curse. Just why did he keep that annoying kappa anyway? Chapter 34, Kagome's Got Problems. 391, 392, 393, 394. Naruto paused in the middle of his push-ups as 2 little feet stopped in front of him. He lazily looked up and saw Rin, as she plopped down, crossing her legs in front of him. What is Naruto-sama doing? She asked, smiling. Training. He replied simply. Why? Oh God no, he had seen this before in other children. They would continue asking why until you couldn't answer anything else, and even then they'd still keep asking why. To get stronger. She stared blankly for a moment. But, Naruto-sama is already strong, why get stronger? He smiled as he shifted from his push-up position onto a sitting position in front of her. Because Rin, people get stronger when they have something, or more importantly someone they want to protect. She seemed to brighten up at that. Oh, so who is it that Naruto-sama wants to protect? He smiled at her innocent nature and put his hand to his chin as if thinking. Well, I can tell you about one. She's about 3.5 feet tall, has long black hair, an orange kimono, likes flowers, and a clump of her hair is tied up in a small side ponytail. Rin looked puzzled for a moment before she looked down at her orange kimono. She blinked and looked back up at his smiling face before she slowly pointed at herself as if uncertain. His smile widened before he nodded, and then winced as an ear-piercing squeal nearly broke his eardrum before he was glomped by the little bundle of joy. He laughed lightheartedly before he stood and placed her on the ground. Come on, Rin, let's get something to eat. It was a few hours later the two found each other eating when Rin squealed again, startling Naruto and An from their meals. J-chan. Rin squealed running up to the exhausted-looking Totosai. The old swordsmith saw the little ball of sunshine almost as if in slow motion, as she gave a leap that could have put one of Jiraiya's toads to shame. Totosai barely had time to raise his hands in defense. No wait. Crash! Ji-chan, you're back, did you get Rin something? Ha. She asked jumping up and down on the very old, very frail, very arthritis-suffering demon. Naruto stood up and walked over, ignoring the small groans that left the old demon's lips in conjunction with each of the girl's jumps and leaned over so he could look down at the old swordsmith. Susu. He drawled. You're back, you said you wouldn't be back for another 3 days. The old swordsmith's eyes snapped open and he suddenly sprung to his feet dragging Rin with him. Somehow she had managed to end up sitting on the old demon's head as he stood up fully. How she had gone from his chest to his head Naruto didn't know. Totosai pointed at Naruto's face. You! Naruto's was completely lost at this point and looked around the cave with his eyes snapping left and right before he pointed at himself. Yes, Myth, the guy that has been staying here for the last 3 weeks or so. The old swordsmith suddenly brought out a huge mallet from somewhere and hit Naruto over the head with it. What are you still doing here? Why are you not at Inuyasha's forest? The Naruto he hit promptly vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving a confused Rin and Totosai. Suddenly, a voice spoke up to their right. I'm still waiting for my sword and I have absolutely no idea why I should go to Inuyasha's forest. Totosai screamed and jumped 10 feet in the air, dislodging Rin from his head where Naruto caught her before she hit the floor. Don't scare an old man like that. What's wrong with you? His head was comically large before it deflated and he scratched his head. What were we talking about again? Naruto's sweat dropped, setting Rin down. He spoke. Well, you showed up and then started yelling about Inuyasha's forest. The old demon got a startled look on his face before he appeared in front of Naruto with speed that would have put Guy in his prime with all 8 gates open to shame. You must go to Inuyasha's forest immediately. Naruto apparently has a new weapon and is heading there right now. Naruto snapped his fingers. Speaking of new weapons. Where's mine? He asked, while wondering what weapon Kyuubi could have granted the spider Hanyu that would make him bold enough to attack head-on. Totosai stared blankly for a moment before finally, you're what? The blonde ninja's eyes got a dangerous twitch in them. My weapon, you know. The one you were supposed to make with the fong I gave you. Oh, that weapon. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, loudly. A bolt of lightning shot down and hit a few feet away where a 3-eyed cow appeared with a bundle in purple silk hanging from its side. Totosai walked over and untied the bundle from the cow and laid it on the floor. Unrolling it, they revealed 2 blades. One was a single-edged curved blade. It had a silver dragon at the hilt with sapphire eyes. If one looked closely into them, they could see a swirling white mass, like a hurricane, inside of it. The blade itself was fairly normal, only the edges of it had a faint blue glow to them. The other blade could be considered an exact opposite. The blade itself was red in color, with a gold fox head at the hilt with ruby red eyes. Flames danced within them. The blade was also a single curved edge. Naruto looked over both of them. Interesting choice of designs. Why did you make 2 of them? Totosai looked at him. I do not design my blades. Each fong is as individual as the demon it came from. It has its own will, So to speak, I merely follow its directions. I made 2 of them for 2 reasons. The first is because it asked me to, and the second is because the Fong held too much power for one blade to safely contain. Naruto snapped his surprised eyes to the old sword-smith's larger ones. Tell me, Netuko. Naruto. The blonde corrected/interrupted. Narita, was it indeed the 9-tailed fox of legend that gave you this Fong? Naruto raised an eyebrow. Now what led you to this conclusion? Totosai shrugged. Many things really, no demon before, or since the greatest of the 9 could hold such power, and the fact that Sunya, the sword used by Inu no Taicho in his conquests, had a similar aura to this one, and that he said, a fox from hell granted him the sword, and the fact that you are the first human in over 4 millennia have strength as great as a demon. Someone told you, didn't they? Totosai fell down anime style and moved to get his mallet when he realized Naruto was leaning on it. He sat down with a huff, muttering about youngsters having no respect before he finally spoke. Yes, an old tree demon, Goshinki, the one that gave me the wood to make the sheaths of your swords, told me. Naruto smiled. There, now, isn't that a lot easier? Totosai humphed before he took both blades and handed them to the blonde. Red chakra came from the fox blade as it pulsed in his hand, and blue chakra came from the dragon blade. He looked at both swords and saw an identical set of teeth they had at the butt of each hilt. He looked at them both and finally placed both swords together. Finding that the teeth matched perfectly, he twisted and heard something click, leaving him with a double-bladed sword. The sword's powers should come naturally to you. Totosai spoke up. I do not know what they might be, but I know that there are 4 of them. Naruto nodded before he disattached the blades from one another, sheathed them in the simple black sheaths Totosai had gotten from Goshinki, and placed them across his back. He nodded in satisfaction as he tightened the straps and looked to Totosai again. You said Naraku got a new weapon, any information on what it might be? Totosai turned to Naruto as he picked his nose. Did you say something? Naruto smacked his forehead. Never mind. He muttered before turning back to the hut. Rin. He called the girl, making her stop as she was playing with On, and run over to him. Yes, Naruto-sama. He kneeled. Say goodbye to Ji-chan. Rin, we have to leave now. She blinked curiously. Why? He smiled. Do you remember why I wanted to get stronger? Because you wanted to protect precious people. She chirped happily. Naruto smiled. Right, and right now, a lot of my precious people are in trouble and I have to go help them, so say goodbye to Ji-chan while I get on. She nodded and ran past him to get to Totosai. Naruto walked over to On, do you know how to get to Inuyasha's forest? He asked the 2-headed reptile. One of Yuen's heads nodded slowly, as the other just stared curiously. Good, I'll be taking Rin on ahead, can you meet us there? Again the dragon nodded. He patted both dragon heads before he turned to walk out of the hut. When he got out he came across a very weird yet funny sight. Totosai was lying on his stomach, out cold, with Rin perched on his back as she made him a crown of flowers. Where she got the flowers from, he really didn't want to know. He walked over and knelt down. Rin, get on my back and hold on tight, we'll be moving very, very fast. She nodded and moved to run behind him when she paused, turned around and placed all of the remaining flowers she had in her hand over Totosai's head. Naruto resisted the urge to laugh as she clambered onto his back, wrapping her small arms around his neck. I'm ready, Naruto-sama. Hold on tight, okay? When he felt her nod, he looked to the southwest and began making his way to Inuyasha's forest, top speed. Lord Sesomaru. Came the high-pitched screech from Jacken as he ran up to the white-clad Taiokai. Sesomaru refrained the urge to grip the bridge of his nose in order to stave off the impending headache and turned to the Kappa. What is it, Jacken? His voice held just a hint of irritation, which Jacken had noticed was growing every day that they did not find Rin. He hastily bowed. My lord, rumors are circulating that Naraku is making his way to Inuyasha's forest. It is probably nothing more than another of his puppets. Even that foolish brother of mine should be able to defeat it. Waste my time again, Jacken, and you will regret it. That said, he turned to leave. Jacken gulped. My lord, I have great reason to believe that this is indeed the real Naraku. They say he carries a weapon of great power. Now this indeed caught Sesomaru's interest. He stopped and looked at his retainer. And what weapon would that be, Jacken? Jacken gulped as he mentally spoke his prayers. My lord, the weapon is... Kagome sighed tiredly as she walked back to the hut. A bundle of herbs was held in a basket on her arm. They had just gotten back to Keed's village just 2 days ago after a short excursion a nearby village to exorcise a weasel demon. She hadn't sensed any jewel shards, but that was normal. It was quite obvious that all the pieces had already been collected by either themselves or Naruto. She could almost see Keed's hut when a sultry laughter reached her ears. Well, isn't this quite a find, a Miko with no weapon, easy pickings for anything short of a low-level demon. Kagome snapped her head around and saw the fox demoness that had attacked their group almost a month ago. You! Kagome gasped before she gained her nerve and glared. What have you done to Shippu? He can't transform back into his human form. To the kit? I have done nothing except give him a little, upgrade. He will learn to return to his human form in time. But you, my dear, have much bigger problems to deal with. Namely, that. The fox demoness pointed behind her, toward the sky. Kagome looked and felt her heart leap into her throat as she saw a massive black mass approaching them. She had seen something similar many times. They were low-level yokai, used by Naruto, but this was absolutely ridiculous. That mass had to be at least close to a mile wide and half a mile high. It was the largest group she had ever seen. She felt the fox demon lean on her back and wrap her arms around her neck in what would be a hug. Well now, won't you be busy today? She could practically feel the smile the demoness had on her face. I have to find everyone. Kagome said as she tried to run to the village. Kyubi grabbed her by the shoulder, spun her around and placed a quiver full of arrows and her bow into Kagome's hands. Like I said, you have bigger problems to worry about, little Miko. Your friends can handle those fodder, you on the other hand, well, let's just say you'll have your hands full. She said the last part as she caressed the girl's cheek. Kyubi gave one last fanged smirk before she vanished in a flash of red light. Kagome looked around for a moment, not seeing the demoness. She was going to make her way to the village when another voice, one that sent a chill crawling up her spine, caressed her ear. Ah, Kagome, there you are. The Miko from the future straightened her shoulders as she turned to face the spider Hanyu. Naruto! She hissed. Oh my, so feisty little Kagome. She notched an arrow into her bow. Naruto watched amused as it glowed a bright pink. Already taking out the weapons, Kagome? He asked with a chiding tone. Well then, I suppose I should take mine out as well, shouldn't I? Kagome watched nervously as Naruto slowly placed his hand over the hilt of a sword. When he unsheathed it, her fear spiked tremendously. She recognized that sword. Sounga. That's it for the part 5 of this series. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.